Welcome, everyone. I'm here on this 15th day of October 2018. I'm here with my new friend Jerome, as a gentleman that I met in a kind of apologetics course as a form. It's a what was it? A presuppositional form? Is that what it was, Jerome?
Something like that. Yeah, I'm in a couple
Okay.
of them. So.
Okay. All right. And it seems like both of us are a little odd man out a little bit in that form. I don't know how I got there. If somebody added me or what, but
Somebody added me for sure. So
okay. All right. And so we had this discussion about discussing with an atheist. I can't remember who it was now. And we were discussing, oh, I know you had made a comment about the importance of employing scientific method to check the validity of a given perspective. And he asked you if you were a young earth creationist wanting to do a smackdown on your own methodology. And you said, no, you're not. And I said, well, I am. And I challenged this fellow. I'm blanking out who he is. And at the end of the day, I've had a crazy day. But anyway, he will not do a hangout with me for anything. I've been trying, and he won't. So he wouldn't, but you said you would. So you graciously granted an audience. So I appreciate that. I just wanted to say welcome.
Well, thank you. I look forward to this. Should be interesting and hopefully educational.
Yeah, I hope so. Before we begin, would you mind telling me a little bit about yourself and where you stand in the spectrum of Christianity? What exactly is your background, maybe denomination? And
Sure. My family comes from actually from an Amish Mennonite background. I currently attend Church of God church. Actually, we're a satellite. I'm working in a satellite church. We're working on a church plant. We got a larger campus that we're involved with the church plant on. And we're going there. It's Church of God is where I've been attending for the last little while. So that's pretty much my as far as my church background. I come from like an Amish Mennonite background. Currently, in Church of God.
Okay, and would you deem yourself or categorize yourself as a born again Christian?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Right. And what is your view of the Bible inspiration? Do you hold to the plenary, infallible inspiration of the Bible?
Well, I am not. I try to use smaller words to describe what I believe, so that I'm sure I understand what I'm saying.
Sure.
So, and I'm sure that other people do. So, my view on Scripture is that God communicated through people using humans, not as typewriters, but as their real words, communicated what He intended to communicate, and did so without any error in what He intended to communicate. Now, our copies and versions of that we have right now, we don't know for sure that they're 100% accurate, but we can know that they are accurate to the point that God has preserved His word, I guess is a good way to put it. There's any errors that may be in Scripture are incidental and do not in any way detract from the message that God intended to communicate of how what people's standing is before God and how to be rightly related to Him.
Okay.
Well, that's a long way. So I don't know exactly where that fits in that category, because like I said, I'm not a trained theologian. So sometimes the big words kind of trip me up. So I try to stay away from them if I'm not totally sure I understand exactly what they mean.
No, that's fine. No problem at all. You're in complete agreement then with me. And I would agree with everything that you said there. So what kind of a view do you hold then regarding, you're an old earth creationist, so the utility of Darwinian synthesis regarding origin of man and of creation?
Explain what you mean by Darwinian synthesis. I want to make sure I'm answering the question you're asking.
Do you believe in common descent, that we, that life started as a single-celled organism and then gradually became more and more complex to the point that, we finally became men. We went from fish, I don't know, for fish to birds to.
I gotcha. The answer to that question is probably not as simple as most people can answer it. I do believe that there is pretty good evidence that the method that God used, to bring about life as it currently is on the planet, including humans, did involve a gradual process of descent from common ancestors. I think it seems like there's good evidence for that. However, I'm not a Darwinian. I don't believe there's any good evidence to support the idea that the evolutionary process, as it's commonly described, can in any way account for life as we see it. So I do believe in common descent, but I'm not a Darwinian. So that's again, sorry, long answer.
I appreciate that.
Probably a simple question.
Yeah. Well, no, you weren't complicated at all. It doesn't make sense to me though. You're against the Darwinian synthesis, and yet you hold to the Darwinian concept of common descent. I don't. Where do you differ with Darwinian evolution then?
Well, not primarily, fundamentally in the idea that random mutation worked on by natural selection can explain the origin or the diversity of life. That is, as best I can tell, completely unsupported scientifically and definitely not theologically.
Okay, so you don't believe in natural selection at all, that species can adapt to their environment through.
Well, do I believe that natural selection can explain things like why different breeds of dogs look differently from each other, or why some animals have different stripes than others, or why sightless fish lost their eyes after many generations living in caves? Yeah, absolutely. I think that, sorry, my phone keeps ringing. I keep hanging up. I'll have to call people back. I think that evolution, in that sense, there's obviously certain things that natural selection can explain, can account for, and I accept that. But I guess the simple way to describe it is, I think that evolution can explain why a fish lost its eyes, but it can't. That's a lot different question from where did eyes come from to begin with.
Okay, yeah, that helps a lot. I appreciate that, because I think that nobody really disagrees that there can be adaptation to environment through the use of natural selection, and no creationist really disagrees with that that I know of. But the problem that you have with the Darwinian synthesis then basically is to say that it's purely naturalistic. There is the postulation in the synthesis that says nothing created everything. In other words, there's no efficient cause, there's no creator to the Darwinian synthesis, and so in your mind, that's just silly.
I don't know if I would use that word. I think that's kind of dismissive, but I definitely disagree with it. I definitely hold the view that we and the world around us only exists because God wished it to be, and if He didn't wish it to exist, it never would have. So, yeah. It's the exact process by which that came about, I think, is interesting from a scientific question. Ultimately, as far as I can tell, the exact mechanism is not as theologically interesting as the question that that issue. The world exists because God willed it to. It wouldn't if He hadn't. Now, sometimes different people disagree. Different Christians of goodwill disagree on the exact mechanism that happened, but that's ultimately the important issue.
Okay, so would you classify yourself as a theistic evolutionist?
I hesitate to use that word only because a lot of people who do use that word to describe themselves, basically, if it comes right down to it, says, yeah, the totally secular view of evolution can explain it, but I kind of think that it makes me feel good to think that God somehow did it. And that's not my position at all. I think there's plenty of really good scientific evidence to support the contention that the Darwinian mechanism is totally insufficient to explain complex life or life at all.
Okay, great. Okay, so from your perspective then, you believe in common descent. How do you deal with the conundrum that the Bible says that God created man specially and did not use the mechanism of evolution from, say, a single cell organism, but he created Adam and Eve specifically as humans in special creation?
Sure. That's actually a really good question. It's something that I've dealt with a lot over my life. I actually, 20 years ago, was very much, I would consider, Ken Ham and I were best buds, not literally. He didn't know who I was, but I was very much in his camp. As far as my position on the issue. And as I learned more about what the apparent physical evidence tells us about the very ancient world and the development of life through time, I found that I actually went through a little bit of a crisis of faith because I went to a church at the time that taught that, if you don't believe this stuff, then you're maybe not a real Christian. And, it's very difficult to be a real Christian and not believe in a 6,000 to 10,000 year old earth and so on and so forth. And as I learned more about from my perspective, at least, very overwhelming physical evidence for a very old earth and a very long process of time for life to develop as the stage developed, I actually, in my late teen years, actually did go through a bit of a crisis of faith over that issue, because it's like, okay, well, it seems like I'm being asked to either close my eyes to the world and believe in God anyway, or something, and thankfully, at least from my perspective, learned that there were lots of Christians out there who held a little bit different of a view on that, so that's a long lead up to say that my current view on the first chapters of Genesis is that God inspired these chapters to be written to communicate very important truths about the nature of man and the nature of our relationship to God to people who were, not because they were stupid, but because of the lack of scientific knowledge at the time, had absolutely no way of conceiving of things like millions of years or subatomic particles or a universe that was billions of light years across, or probably lots of things that we'll discover now in the future that people today don't understand, but that God inspired the Bible to be written to communicate these totally true spiritual truths in a way that could be understood by people without that education. And a good example that I had would be very much like how in elementary school we learn about atoms and electrons, and we get this idea that atoms orbit the nucleus of the atom, and they look a lot like miniature solar systems. And it's only much later in high school, or a lot of times in college, that we learn that actually that picture that we were given by our elementary teachers in order to sort of start to understand the concept of atoms actually is nothing at all what atoms look like. But our teachers didn't lie to us. They were explaining concepts to us in ways that at our level of education, our level of ability to understand, we could grasp. So they taught us true things, but if someone would go back and say, oh, well, either your elementary school teacher was lying to you, or you have to accept, in order to accept this new, more scientifically accurate picture of the model, you have to say, well, my teacher was a liar. Well, no, your teacher didn't lie to you. your teacher explained very important concepts to you using pictures that you were able to understand, even though the pictures themselves were not exactly literalistically accurate. And I think that that's a good way of understanding what was going on in the first chapters of Genesis.
Okay, well, I think it's fair to say that God does use analogical language. That's what's called language of accommodation to us, because it is necessary for him to accommodate himself, because he doesn't change, and he doesn't think in such a way where he predicates about things. He knows everything all at once, and so he must accommodate his language somewhat. However, when you're using such a thing as analogical language, it must have some correspondence to what really is happening, and it cannot be arbitrary, and it can't be too far away. Otherwise, it becomes equivocal, where you're really talking about two completely separate things, and it doesn't really work. So my problem is with your saying that Adam and Eve. So you're saying that basically the first, maybe the first 11 chapters of Genesis were speaking more allegorically rather than literal history. Would that be a fair thing to say?
I would. Yeah, not that's. We can maybe quibble a little about the exact terminology, but yeah, more or less along those lines.
Okay. So how do you deal with the fact that Jesus spoke of Adam and Eve? Say, for example, in Matthew 19, he says, have you not read that he created them from the beginning, made them male and females? This said, therefore, for this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother, and the two shall become one flesh, and what God has put together, let no man separate. How do you deal with that, with Christ referring to Adam and Eve as historical figures?
Well, again, if I'm right, and the purpose of the Genesis story is to teach us totally true things about the nature of how humans are to relate to the world, how we relate to each other, what our position is before God, then what Christ is teaching about Adam and, using that, yes, that is what the Bible teaches, and it uses the story of Adam and Eve to teach that. And if my position is correct, and the purpose of that is to teach us true things about human nature and how humans are supposed to relate to each other, then what Christ is teaching is not in any way deterred by the fact that didn't actually happen 10,000 years ago or whatever. I'm going to turn on a light because it's getting dark in here, and my face looks funny in this. So give me just a second.
Sure, no problem.
There, now you can see me better.
Okay, great.
The sun was setting here behind me, so
yeah, it's no problem. Okay, so Christ was referring to Adam and Eve over and over as historical figures, but he really didn't mean to say that. And
well, I believe he did mean to say that. I mean, I don't think that Adam and Eve are. I mean, there had to be first people, right? I mean, at some point it had to, that is not a, I don't think that was something that it was a mistake. I don't think he was saying something he didn't mean to say it.
Okay. Well, how did sin enter the world?
I'm sorry?
How did sin and death enter the world?
Sin entered the world through the choice of humans to sin. And
so there was no death. There was no death before Adam and Eve.
No human death.
Oh, well, there was no death at all before there was Adam and Eve. Entropy did not enter into the picture until Adam and Eve sinned.
If the young Earth creation is strictly literal interpretation of Genesis is the correct one, then yes, that would be the case. That's not the position that I hold, though. So yes, I do believe that. Yes, in my view, there were billions of years of animal death prior to the first humans existing in the world. Yes, that is a necessary. If my view is correct, that's necessarily a part of the picture. Yes.
Okay. So when God said, when he finished the creation, he said that he said it was good. I think he said it was good, and then he said it was very good on the sixth day. And God saw all that he made, and behold, it was very good. And there was evening and there was morning the sixth day. So on the last of it, everything was good. But you're saying there was millions or even billions of years of death and decay and destruction, in God calling it very good.
That is a necessary implication of my view. Yes.
Okay, so it's contradictory then. You're okay with that?
I don't know. I don't think it's contradictory. If I thought that animal death was necessarily evil, I would be a vegetarian.
Yeah, but wasn't death a consequence of sin? In other words, there is no reason for God.
Human spiritual, in my view, that would be relating to human spiritual death as separation from God, not relating to simple biological animal death. That would be, yes, a necessary.
Okay, so God introduced death into the earth for no reason.
Oh, not for no reason. That's
I mean, don't you think Darwinian evolution is a very ugly system, which is really gross, where you have, everything red in tooth and claw, destroying each other and having death? I mean, it's so ugly and gross. And I don't understand how you can say that God somehow pleasured in creating mankind through such a disgusting way, and all the while calling it good.
Well, are you a vegetarian?
I am not. I love meat, but I was God gave liberty to Noah to eat meat after the flood.
Here's what I'm getting at with that. Okay. If animal death really was evil in the way that you are describing it here, then as Christians, to be consistent, we would say we should be vegetarians, because there are all kinds of things that we recognize as human evil that we know exist in the world because of sin, but we as Christians are called to abstain from them. So if animal death really was an evil result of sin in the way that you're describing, then I think, to be consistent, we should be vegetarians. But you're not a vegetarian, which leads me to and I'm not either, for the same reason. I don't believe that animal death in and of itself is an evil in the sense that you're describing. Otherwise, I wouldn't eat meat.
Okay, but God didn't give them liberty to eat animals in the garden. That freedom was only given to Noah after the flood. So Adam and Eve were vegetarians. So I don't understand why would you? I mean, we've been given permission explicitly in that. Adam and Eve were explicitly not given that liberty. Why would you impose that? I don't understand that.
Well, again, if we were to take the totally literal perspective on that, then you would be right. Yes. But I don't. So, I don't take it totally. Because I don't take it totally literally. I guess I am looking at the larger picture of it. And I view in my view, the no animal death implication in the literal version of the text is to be taken allegorically.
And the existence of sin being a curse upon creation is allegorical.
I'm sorry, what was that?
The curse of sin upon the earth because of mankind's sin is not really true. It's just allegorical. Somehow there's some other reason for the death and destruction and the entropic factor of our universe other than mankind's sin in your Christianity. Would that be fair?
If I understand the question you're asking correctly, yes, that is allegorical. Yes.
Okay, so why is God cursing creation? What's the reason for him being angry to bring death to creation besides mankind's sin?
I don't believe that was a result of God's anger. That like I said,
so God's
from my
blessing is
perspective,
to see animals eat each other and to destroy each other and to suffer. Is He's pleasures in that? Is that what you're saying?
well, again, if
I mean, look at the way
yes.
humans treat each other, and you want to say, "Oh, that was everywhere except for humans." Why would God be such a sadist to be so destructive toward His own creation for no reason?
And again, if that would be sadistic and cruel, then as Christians,
You don't
then
think
I
it
mean,
is?
I would, if that is, if that is your view, then I would challenge you to reconsider your non-vegetarianism because you're participating in sadism and cruelty. If that is the case,
No,
um,
because God has told me as an accommodation that I may eat animals, not because He pleasures in it. We won't be eating animals in the eternal kingdom. There won't be any
so
death there.
God is accommodating sadism and cruelty in you as a Christian. Is that what you're saying?
I'm not sure what you mean.
You said that God gave you permission as an accommodation, but you're also saying it's sadism and cruelty. I'm saying so God is accommodating sadism and
He is
cruelty in such
accommodating
a way.
our sinful world in which we have and not giving us what we deserve, and He gives us the liberty
Yeah.
to eat
But
animals.
you could be a vegetarian. You could live. You wouldn't die if you lived a vegetarian lifestyle. I know people who do it and are quite healthy. So if if animal death is sadism and cruelty, then that's sadism and cruelty that you're participating in. I guess I would challenge you as a
No.
Christian.
The sadism
Because
and
Jesus,
cruelty came from mankind, I'm saying, and God accommodates us and is gracious with us in our sinfulness. You're saying death and cruelty came before man's sin, and I'm trying to figure out what in the
no,
world would
I'm saying
what make God want to be so cruel.
Jesus said, there's one example in the scripture about where Jesus talks about an accommodation that God made for people's sin. Specifically, talks about divorce and remarriage.
Right.
And then he says, but I say, and I'm paraphrasing here, no, God accommodated this because of your sinfulness, but I am saying no more. The way that God intended it from the beginning is the way you should do it. That's the one example we have in scripture specifically talking about the idea of God accommodating human sinfulness. And Jesus explicitly tells Christians, okay, that was then, but now I'm holding you to a higher standard.
Okay, so what's the then?
Hold on, let me finish.
Okay.
If eating meat is only an accommodation to human sin, then as a Christian, you should be a vegetarian. Following that same principle that Jesus laid out.
You're arguing something that's just like way off the track of what we're talking about. We're talking about the introduction of evil in the world. And I'm saying the Bible teaches that entropy, you know what entropy is? Second law of thermodynamics, that everything is falling apart, basically. Started and now it's unwinding, it's going down. Entropy was introduced into this universe through the sin of mankind. But you're saying, no, entropy.
That's kind of your reading into it. That's another one of those concepts that, again, when the Bible was written, wasn't even a concept. If you'd have talked about entropy and the idea of the universe winding down as a concept, have been very difficult for people without a scientific education.
So
you are reading into what the scripture actually says there, and applying.
Let me ask you one more time. What is the reason for God inflicting pain and suffering on this earth if it's not a judgment for sin? What is it? Why would He do such a thing? Because the Bible teaches that sin entered the world through one man. Destruction entered because of one man. But you're saying, no, destruction entered for some other reason. And I'm understanding why is God so mad at a perfect creation that He made?
God isn't mad at His creation.
Okay, then why is He being so gross with it? So cruel to His creatures?
Again, I don't believe animals are not the sort of creatures for whom death is the horror and the suffering that it is for humans.
You just said it's sinful to eat animals now.
No,
it doesn't matter.
No, I didn't. I'm saying that if you really believe that eating animals was sinful,
Is
then you
it
shouldn't.
sad that you have to eat it? You have to kill a chicken to eat it? Does that bother you at all?
If it bothered me, I'd be a vegetarian.
Would you rather not have to kill a chicken to eat it?
I don't have to kill a chicken. I could be a vegetarian, as could you.
I'm saying, would you prefer that there be no killing of chickens in this world? No killing of anything of sentient life?
Would I prefer that and still have meat to eat?
No.
Yeah, sure,
Okay.
absolutely.
So you concede that it's a bad thing that things die.
No, you are. I think you're conflating ideas. I would prefer a world where I didn't have to cut down trees to build houses. I'm kind of sad when I cut down a big, beautiful tree too, but that doesn't mean that I think that
because it's killing life.
What? But that doesn't mean that.
But you're saying that it's a good thing, and it got introduced that for.
Of course, it's a good thing because I have a house to live in from it. So do you.
And that's right. You see a greater good in that. But if you could have your way, you just said you would rather not have to kill the tree to have a house to live in.
Well, yeah, emotionally, absolutely.
Okay, you seem like you're contradicting yourself in your own view. You're saying that death is a good thing, but you don't like death.
There are lots of good things that I don't like. I don't like getting stuck with needles, but I like vaccinations.
Okay, but you're conceding the fact that death and suffering and decay are bad things, and yet you say God has inflicted the world without reason these things, apart from the sin of mankind. Why would he do such a thing?
No,
sounds like a monster to me.
I didn't say it was without reason.
What is the reason? Well, I've been asking this 6 times. I think I've asked. What is the reason? Why did he do that?
What was the reason for destruction? What was the reason for a world with animal death? Is that what you're asking?
The whole of destruction over the billions of years you say that it took for mankind to get here.
Because life requires death. You can't have animals without plants dying, and you can't have predator animals without prey animals, and you can't have more frogs being born unless the old frogs die.
So in heaven, there will only be things living and dying as well, because you can't have it without that.
Do I believe that in heaven? Well, yeah, I'm sure. I believe that if we're going to eat at all, something's going to have to die.
So there's going to be death and destruction in the new heavens and the new earth.
Are there not going to be any potatoes or tomatoes in heaven?
I know this, that
are there only going to be fruit crops in heaven? Because most of the food, including the plant food that you eat, is from plants that die, and you have to plant a new one next season. So okay. Yeah, I'm pretty certain unless there's not going to be any potatoes and tomatoes and other annual crops in heaven, then yeah, there's going to be some form of death and rebirth, death and new stuff growing in heaven too. Absolutely.
Okay, well, it says in new heaven there will be no more death, mourning, crying, or pain. So if there's going to be no more death, how do you deal with that?
Same way that I deal with it in the Genesis account, that it's referring to human spiritual death.
Okay, so there will be death in heaven, even though
plant death, unless life in heaven is so unlike life on earth that I can't even conceive of how it would be. Then, if we're going to eat any sort of food, then there's going to be plant death in heaven, at the very least.
Okay, so the scriptures are wrong in saying that there will be no more death. There will be certain types of death.
Again, I don't believe the scriptures are wrong. I believe that the scriptures are totally right in what they're referring to, which is human spiritual death.
Okay, so is it possible to have, you said there had to be frogs and all those things dying, so there's going to be still going to be death of animals as well in heaven. There's going to be generation and decay.
Unless life in heaven is so unlike life on earth that we wouldn't really recognize it as such, then
do you agree that death is a result of the curse of God?
I agree that human spiritual death is, yes.
Death, period. Man dying, because I think in Galatians it talks about that before the law there was still death that was reigning, and he's speaking of physical human death until the promise of God, Christ being the second Adam. And again, I don't know how Christ can be a second Adam. Adam never really.
Pretty sure that Romans is talking about spiritual death, because all those first century Christians, including Paul, still died physically.
Say it again.
Human death didn't stop for Christians at the resurrection of Christ.
No, because it's not consummated. We have the promise, but it's not fulfilled. There's not glorification. When Christ rose from the dead, all sin was not eradicated.
But what I'm saying is that the primary meaning of that passage is referring to spiritual death. In the passage you're quoting in Romans that Paul wrote is referring to spiritual death.
No, I'm talking about Galatians here. I can't. I'm not able to find it here. But anyway, it said the death reigned before the law, and well, I can't find it for some reason. But anyway,
a very similar passage in Romans, which I'm familiar with because that's what I'm reading through right now. So,
okay, and but you're saying that death is not a curse. Physical death is not a result of the curse of the fall.
Physical, animal, and plant death is not a result of the curse of the fall. That's correct.
Okay. And
that's a necessary implication of my view, yes.
Okay, so God has to kill in order to bring life, and that's why he did it. He doesn't like death, but that's the way it has to be.
I don't know that God has to. God can do anything he wants. I mean, I'm never going to tell you what God has to do.
Okay, then what was his reason for introducing death if he didn't have to, without it being a result of sin?
Presumably because the cycle of life is something that God wanted to create.
Okay, so he wanted to introduce death because he thought it was pleasurable to introduce death as a good thing, even though he says it's a bad thing and he's going to abolish it someday in heaven.
Well, again, I am not conceding that there will be no physical death in the new world. I would be very surprised if we're not eating crops that have to be planted on an annual basis in heaven.
Okay.
So there will be death unless I'm, and I would be very surprised if we're not eating, recognizably the same kind of food as what we're eating now. Let's put it that way.
Okay. So you're saying that because you're not going to believe what the scriptures say and said there will be no more death, mourning, crying, or pain. The old order will be passed away and all things will be new. There will still be death, but it just won't affect us.
I do believe that. I believe that that's referring primarily to human spiritual death.
Okay, but not human spiritual, physical death. I mean, it's not death a judgment? Death reigned from Adam until Christ.
Human death, yeah. And if in the resurrection there will be no more human death. That's correct. But we're still going to eat food in heaven. I would be very surprised if we're not still eating food in heaven.
Okay, well, I don't know how things are going to exactly move, but I know that there will be no death because death is a curse of God. But I guess you're trying to be consistent in saying that animals eating each other and mothers eating their babies and things were somehow God's pleasure. And then somehow when man sinned, it's like God says, "Oh, how dare you do that?" And then he just slaps on humans on top of that. But death was already, everything else was already there except for just.
I think that the a good way of thinking about it from as this, and this isn't original with me. This wasn't my original idea. I actually cribbed this from C.S. Lewis. But a good way of thinking about it is that humans in our original state of innocence, we had we had spiritual life, and what that meant is that through our relationship with God, we in our spirits were able to, in some way, rule over our physical bodies in the sense that we were not subject to the natural processes that governed the animals. Even we were biological, but we ruled over them instead of them half of the time ruling over us. And that what the fall consisted of, in large part, was losing when we lost our spiritual relationship with God. That in the fall, that we fell back into the matrix, so to speak, that governs biological life. And the curse is that humans who were meant to be sons of God instead became governed by their biology instead of governing their biology. And that the spiritual renewal in heaven, not entirely, but in large part, will consist of our spirits again retaining their natural position that they were intended for, which was governing our biology instead of being governed by it.
Okay. So there was some death. It just got worse because you're saying in large part.
There was
Adam and Eve would have died.
No. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that Adam and Eve died because they fell back into the position of the animals, which was being governed by biology, instead of their spirits, which were made to be sons and daughters of God, to rule over their biology, instead fell back into being ruled by it like the animals were. And that is why humans, although humans were not made to suffer death, but did. And that is why it is a curse for us.
Okay, so everything else is made to die and to suffer. That's God's good pleasure. But humans are
I don't believe it's suffering in the sense. Death is not suffering for animals, and definitely not for plants in the way that it is for us. Humans dying is a suffering and horror and the worst possible imaginable thing, because we weren't made for it.
Animals were made to get the mange and to have illnesses and die painful and slow deaths because that was God's pleasure. And to eat each other too, and to eat their own young too.
Well, and again, I come back to I know there are certain, emotionally, it doesn't feel, I know that certain emotions you say, but again, and I don't hate to keep beating a dead horse, but if as Christians we really believe that was true, then we should start to the best that we can today living. We should live like we believe that, and if we really believe that animals suffer the way that, in that sense, that is evil in the way that human suffering is, then we shouldn't participate in it.
Yeah, but you already told me yourself that you think it is evil that we have to eat animals.
No, I didn't. I didn't say it was.
You said if we could have meat without killing animals, you would prefer that.
I'm talking about my emotions.
I'm talking about your logic. What do you logically, you think it's fine to have, you love to see things suffer logically. In other words, logically, you think that it's a good thing to have death. I don't care about your emotions. Let's talk about logic.
Okay. Logically, yes, I agree that plant death, definitely. And if I am right, I view animal death. Sure, it's part of the biological cycle that God made. Absolutely.
Okay, so death is not. Death is. You said that God could have done it without doing it that way, right?
No, I said I'm not going to say whether or not God could have, because it's not my place to.
You said that God could do whatever He wanted to do.
Yeah, absolutely. God
could have. Okay, let me ask you this: so Adam and Eve, how old were they in the Bible when they were created?
How old were they when they were created? I don't.
If you were to take the biblical mandate to say directly. Were they made as children or were they made as adults?
You're talking about in the Genesis account?
From my perspective.
Presumably adults, but it doesn't specifically say, but I mean, I don't know that it specifically says whether or not they were made as children or adults, but
they weren't made as embryos. You would agree with that, right? according to the biblical account.
Right. They weren't made as embryos.
Probably made as young men and women.
I mean, very possibly.
With maturity, would you say that?
Presumably. I mean, that's, I don't know that it ever specifically says anywhere, but presumably, yes.
Well, obviously, I mean, they're created and they interact with each other in a way that adults would interact with each other. And then it says that if God, on day 3, he creates the land and the plants and all that stuff. Do you believe that when Jesus multiplied the bread, do you believe that he really created that bread ex nihilo?
I don't know if he used existing atoms and reformed them or created them out of nothing. I have no idea.
Okay. Did he make bread out of grain that had never been planted, had never grown, never was harvested, never was crushed, never was put together in flour, never was baked?
Yes. I won't quibble over whether or not there was ever grain before bread. So yes.
Okay. When he changed the water into wine, was that wine that he made that out of? Were they ever grapes that were seeds that were planted and harvested and crushed and fermented before he gave them the greatest wine?
Presumably not.
Do you believe that?
The way it's described, either those processes happen very, very rapidly, or it just went straight from water to wine without any intervening process. So I presumably that.
So you do believe in the miracle of that?
Oh, absolutely. I absolutely believe in miracles.
Now, what is the substantial difference between that and God creating ex nihilo everything, if he wanted to, with maturity?
When you say with maturity, describe what you mean.
Adam and Eve being fully formed humans.
I mean, if he wanted to, he could have done that.
Okay, so why is that a problem for you? I mean, if you want to allegorize...
Why is what a problem for me? I don't understand what you're asking.
Well, I'm saying you're very happy to concede miracles in the New Testament, but you're not willing to concede a miracle of creation in the creation of mankind, and you're wanting to introduce death and suffering apart from sin. I mean, it just seems like an incredible leap that you're wanting to make to really, I feel like, wrench the scriptures rather than just read them for their plain reading.
Well, again, keep in mind that for a long time that was my view as well. The reason that I have come to the conclusion that what got me down the path of that ultimately arrived at the conclusion that is not the accurate reading, the accurate understanding is the apparent many millions and billions of years worth of fossil layers that show literally billions of years of life before there's the first evidence of any humans on the world. So unless if God created the world to look like there was billions of years of death and decay before man, and just but it's all just a smokescreen, then I mean that's logically possible.
Smokescreen that Adam and Eve were made fully formed. The Bible very clearly tells us that God made them with maturity, in the garden as well. So I don't understand the great leap for you. And you say that God can do anything, and yet you want to say, well, no, God couldn't do that. And you have to sacrifice theology of the entrance of sin into the world. I mean, it seems like you want to be liked by the scientific community rather than to follow the scriptures, what they plainly teach.
I'm sorry. I want to be. What did you say? You had a noise going off in the background there.
Liked by the scientific community, the secular scientific community.
No, I get called all kinds of nasty names by people who consider themselves to be secular scientists. So I don't think I'm too worried about that.
Why you feel you need to adopt their perspective when it's quite incoherent?
Well, again, like I said, the reality of the matter is that the many tens of meters of fossil layers of with all kinds of obviously creatures that died in layers that are in some places hundreds of feet below the first layer that there's any evidence of any human bones. I mean, that's not something that someone made up as some sort of grand
Well,
conspiracy to
there's
disprove your
not very many.
theology.
Yeah, but there's not very many humans in relationship to all of the life and those things that could have died in the flood. Would you agree with that?
The flood is really not a very good answer because if it had happened in some sort of global flood, then it wouldn't have. If all those things existed simultaneously and all died in a flood, they would have all been intermingled and mixed together, not laid down in layers where things that are where layers all this type of thing is in one layer and then there's no more, and then stuff that wasn't in this layer is in this layer, and then you can trace it on up, and very, very consistent all around the world, similarly. If they really all were alive at the same time and died in some sort of global catastrophe, they would very likely be more mixed together than that, at least.
Well, there's sedimentary layers in every type of catastrophic occurrence that you have that comes.
Sure, but when there's a flood, if a flood washes through a valley and kills everything in the valley, all the stuff that's alive in that valley at the same time gets all jumbled together. Not that
well, it doesn't happen all exactly. Okay, well, that's still not going to say there's not going to be any layers laid down. I mean, you've got as the rain come down, you can have layers of lakes overflowing and breaking, and as there's a process that is occurring through that layers and layers and layers are being laid down until you got the complete Earth having a global flood. I mean, you know that there's the equivalent of 3 oceans of water within the Earth, right?
Yeah. So if there had been some sort of global flood, through some divine miraculous process that covered the entire world, then yes, there could be sedimentary layers. But again, I feel like you haven't quite addressed the point I'm getting at, is that in those sedimentary layers, everything that was alive at that time would all be jumbled together. You wouldn't have different types of life in different layers and things that.
Well, different types of organisms are going to die at different ways and size, and the type of organism that they they're going to be dying in those sort of ways.
With all respect, if you have looked at this with any sort of close examination, you wouldn't make that argument, because it's not a matter of, well, smaller and bigger things. It's a matter of 3/4 of the layers being nothing but microscopic life, and then many layers, and some of them much larger animals than humans, many layers of animals going through a progression, and then just the very top, like, relatively speaking, the last few tenths of a percent with humans in them. It is not it's just not an adequate explanation for what we actually see in the ground. It's just not.
Okay. All right. That's not my specialty anyway. So I will grant you that, because that's not something I've really studied in depth. Well, I need to go. I've still got a bunch of work before I can go home tonight.
Me too.
So anyway, I'm grateful for your giving me an audience here, Jerome, and it's very nice to meet you.
Yeah, you too.
I appreciate your sharing your perspective with me, and maybe we can even continue the conversation in the future if you'd like.
Yeah, absolutely. Anytime.
Okay. All right. Great. Well, thank you very much. You have a great evening. Okay.
You too. Talk to you later.
Okay.